I'm Alexandra Warren, 28 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew who I was. My grandmother Evelyn was the only one who truly loved me, something I never fully understood until the night of my accident. As I lay bleeding in that hospital bed, I heard my parents whisper those unthinkable words, "She's not our real daughter. They left me to die," then came for my inheritance a week later, but all they found was my letter. If you could have seen their faces when they read it. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button and prepare yourself for a story about betrayal, justice, and the true meaning of family. Growing up in our spacious colonial house in the suburbs of Boston, I had what most would consider a privileged life. My father, Richard Warren, was a successful investment banker who proudly displayed his Harvard degree in his home office. My mother, Margaret, was a real estate agent known for selling luxury homes to the city's elite. From the outside, we were the picture-perfect American family. Sunday brunches, summer vacations to Martha's Vineyard, and professional family portraits hanging perfectly aligned on our living room wall. But something always felt off. While my parents provided everything material I could need, there was an emotional distance that I could never quite bridge. My achievements were acknowledged with polite nods rather than true pride. My tears were met with impatient sighs rather than comforting hugs. Looking back, I realize now that there was always something performative about their parenting, as if they were playing roles they had studied rather than expressing genuine feelings. The exception to this emotional coldness was my grandmother Evelyn. Mom's mother lived just 20 minutes away in a beautiful Victorian house filled with antiques and the smell of freshly baked cookies. While my parents viewed my artistic tendencies as impractical, Grandma Evelyn encouraged my painting and writing. She would sit with me for hours in her sunroom, telling me stories about her youth while I sketched. "You have a special light in you, Alexandra," she would often say, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear with a gentleness my mother never showed. "Never let anyone dim that light." When I was 12, I overheard a strange conversation between Grandma and my mother. I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water during one of our Sunday visits. "She deserves to know the truth," Grandma Evelyn said firmly. "There's nothing to know," my mother replied coldly, "and I would appreciate it if you would stop filling her head with nonsense. Richard and I are her parents. End of story." When I entered the kitchen, they both fell silent immediately. My grandmother gave me a sad smile while my mother busied herself with rearranging items in the refrigerator. I asked what they were talking about, but my mother quickly dismissed it as adult business. That night I lay awake wondering what truth I deserved to know, but I was too afraid to ask directly. Despite my parents' emotional distance, I excelled academically. I graduated high school as valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to NYU for graphic design. My parents seemed more relieved than proud when I moved to New York, as if my absence made their lives easier somehow. Meanwhile, Grandma Evelyn called me every Sunday without fail and visited me in the city several times a year. After college, I landed a job at a prestigious marketing firm in Boston and moved back to Massachusetts, partly to be closer to my grandmother, who was starting to show signs of age. I bought a small condo about halfway between my parents' house and Grandma Evelyn's, establishing a life independent from my parents while making it easy to visit my grandmother regularly. When Grandma turned 80, her health began to decline more rapidly. She was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and I took on the role of her primary caretaker. My parents visited occasionally, but they always seemed uncomfortable and eager to leave. I, on the other hand, treasured our time together, often working remotely from her sunroom so she wouldn't be alone. During one of these afternoons, about 6 months before she passed away, Grandma Evelyn became unusually serious. "Alexandra, darling," she said, her voice weaker, but her eyes still sharp. "There are things about our family that you should know, things I've wanted to tell you for years." Before she could continue, we were interrupted by the arrival of her home health nurse. When I tried to return to the conversation later, Grandma seemed tired and said, "Another time, dear. But know that I've made arrangements. Everything is in my will. Franklin has all the documents." Franklin Barnes was my grandmother's attorney, a kind elderly man who had been handling her legal affairs for decades. I didn't think much of her comment at the time, assuming she was simply referring to standard inheritance matters. A week later, my parents suddenly began showing more interest in Grandma Evelyn. They started visiting more frequently, bringing expensive gifts and offering to help with her care. Their sudden attention felt strange and insincere, especially when they began questioning me about Grandma's finances and whether she had made any changes recently. "Has she mentioned anything about her will?" my father asked casually during one visit while my mother pretended to dust the bookshelves in Grandma's study. "No," I lied instinctively, something in me not trusting their sudden interest. "We don't talk about things like that." The truth was, Grandma had mentioned updating her will just the day before. "I want to make sure you're taking care of Alexandra," she had said. "You're the only one who's truly been here for me." Grandma Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 months later. At her funeral, my parents put on an impressive show of grief, my mother dabbing at dry eyes with a black handkerchief, while my father accepted condolences with a solemn nod. I meanwhile felt truly broken, having lost the one person who seemed to genuinely love me. Little did I know that within 24 hours my entire understanding of my life and family would be shattered forever. The evening after my grandmother's funeral was rainy and cold, matching my mood perfectly as I drove back from the reception at my parents' house. I had left earlier than expected, unable to bear their performative grief any longer. The way they had paraded around accepting condolences while discussing Grandma Evelyn's house and possessions in hushed tones when they thought I wasn't listening had made me physically ill. I was driving my modest Honda Civic along the winding road that led from the affluent neighborhood where my parents lived toward my much smaller condo. The rain had intensified, making visibility poor. My mind was clouded with grief and memories of my grandmother's tears, occasionally blurring my vision further. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't have been driving in that state. I remember checking my phone when it buzzed with a text from my mother asking where I'd put Grandma's jewelry box before I left. Not about how I was feeling or if I'd gotten home safely, just the jewelry. I looked down for just a second, but that was all it took. When I looked up, headlights were bearing down on me from the wrong lane. I swerved sharply, my car hydroplaning on the wet asphalt. Everything after that came in flashes, the sickening crunch of metal, the airbag exploding against my chest, the world spinning as my car rolled down the embankment, and then darkness. I drifted in and out of consciousness as paramedics worked to extract me from the wreckage. I remember fragments of their urgent voices: female, late 20s, multiple traumas, possible internal bleeding, need to move quickly. The next clear memory I have is waking up in the ICU, surrounded by beeping machines and the antiseptic smell of hospital disinfectant. My body felt like one massive bruise, and I could barely move. A nurse with kind eyes, Rachel according to her name tag, was adjusting my IV when she noticed I was awake. "Try not to move, honey," she said gently. "You've been in an accident. You're at Massachusetts General. The doctor will be in soon to talk to you." The doctor, a serious man named Dr. Patterson, explained the extent of my injuries: several broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding, and a traumatic brain injury that they were monitoring closely. But the most concerning issue was damage to my spine. There was an experimental treatment that could potentially prevent permanent paralysis, but it needed to be administered within 72 hours of the injury. "We've discussed this with your parents," Dr. Patterson said, his expression carefully neutral. "They're speaking with the hospital administration about the costs, as this treatment isn't covered by insurance." I nodded weakly, assuming my parents would handle it. Despite our distant relationship, they had always been financially supportive. The thought that they might refuse to pay for a treatment I desperately needed never crossed my mind. That night, drifting in and out of consciousness due to the pain medication, I heard my parents' voices near my bed. I kept my eyes closed, feeling too exhausted to engage with them, but their words cut through my medicated haze with crystal clarity. $200,000 is absurd," my father was saying, his voice low but angry. "The insurance won't cover it, and there's no guarantee it will even work." "It's not like she's our real daughter," my mother replied, her voice so cold it sent a chill through my broken body despite the hospital blankets. "I never wanted to go through with that arrangement in the first place." "Keep your voice down," my father hissed. "This isn't the time or place." "Well, when is the right time, Richard? We've been pretending for 28 years. And now we're expected to spend our money on an experimental treatment for what? So she can take Evelyn's inheritance too. I wanted to scream to demand explanations, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I remained frozen listening as my parents, the people who had raised me, discussed my fate as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient financial burden. Franklin called this afternoon, my father continued. The will reading is scheduled for next week. If she doesn't make it, everything comes to us as her next of kin. There was a pause, and then my mother spoke, her voice calculating. How long did the doctor say the brain swelling could last? Without the treatment, it could get worse. They're not optimistic. Another pause, longer this time. Then perhaps we should let nature take its course. It would be kinder, really, than leaving her paralyzed. I felt something inside me shatter. The people who had tucked me in at night, attended my school plays, and taught me to drive, were now coldly calculating whether my death would be more profitable than my survival. And what did they mean I wasn't their real daughter? After they left, I couldn't hold back the tears that streamed down my face. Nurse Rachel came in to check my vitals and noticed immediately. Honey, are you in pain? I can increase your medication, she offered, concern evident in her voice. My parents, I managed to whisper. I heard them talking. They're not going to pay for the treatment. Rachel's expression shifted subtly. I shouldn't say this, but I had a bad feeling about them. The way they were asking about your prognosis. It didn't feel right. They said I'm not their real daughter. I whispered the words, feeling strange on my tongue. What does that even mean? Rachel took my hand. I don't know, sweetie, but I promise you're not alone in this. I'm going to call social services first thing in the morning. We have resources for patients in situations like yours. That night, lying in the dark hospital room, I made a promise to myself. I would survive with or without my parents' help. And I would discover the truth about who I really was and why the people who raised me could so callously leave me to die. 3 days passed in a blur of pain, medical tests, and increasing anxiety about the experimental treatment window closing. Nurse Rachel had been true to her word and contacted the hospital's social services department. A compassionate social worker named Samantha Wilson took on my case, working tirelessly to find alternative funding for my treatment. We have an emergency medical fund for cases like yours, Samantha explained, sitting beside my hospital bed, and I've been in contact with several foundations that might help. Meanwhile, my parents visited only once more, their expressions carefully composed into masks of concern whenever medical staff were present. When we were alone, they spoke primarily about practical matters, my apartment, my bills, whether I had updated my own will. Not once did they mention the treatment I desperately needed. On the 4th day after my accident, just as the treatment window was about to close, Samantha burst into my room with a triumphant smile. We got it. The Harriman Foundation has approved emergency funding for your treatment. They're transferring the funds now, and Dr. Patterson has scheduled the procedure for this afternoon. When my parents arrived later that day and discovered the treatment was going forward, their reactions were revealing. My father's face tightened with barely concealed anger, while my mother's smile became brittle. Who authorized this? My father demanded. As her parents, we should have been consulted. Miss Warren is 28, Dr. Patterson replied coolly. She's fully capable of making her own medical decisions, and as she was the one who signed the consent forms, no further authorization was needed. The look my father gave me was one I'll never forget, a mixture of fury and calculation that made it clear I had become an obstacle rather than a daughter in his eyes. The treatment was painful and the recovery difficult, but within 2 weeks I had regained some feeling in my legs. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about my eventual recovery, though they warned it would take months of intensive physical therapy. It was during this recovery period that I received an unexpected visitor. Franklin Barnes, my grandmother's attorney, came to see me, his aged face grave as he took in my injured state. Alexandra, my dear, he said, settling into the chair beside my bed. I've been trying to reach you. I was deeply troubled when your parents told me you were unlikely to recover. They said what I was shocked but not surprised. They told you I was dying. Franklin nodded, his expression troubled. They suggested the will reading should proceed without you given your grave condition. I insisted on seeing for myself. He opened his briefcase and removed several documents. Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes. The bulk of her estate, including the house and investments worth approximately $3 million, has been left to you. Despite everything, I felt a wave of grief rather than satisfaction. I don't care about the money, I just miss her. I know, dear, Franklin said gently, but there's something else you should know. Something Evelyn wanted me to tell you privately. He hesitated. It concerns your adoption. Adoption. The word hung in the air between us. What are you talking about? Franklin looked uncomfortable. According to the documents Evelyn provided me, you were adopted by the Warrens as an infant. Evelyn discovered this fact only about 10 years ago, and had been struggling with whether to tell you. My mind raced back to the overheard conversation when I was 12, to my grandmother's attempt to tell me the truth before she died, to my parents' cold words in the hospital. She's not our real daughter. Do you have the adoption papers? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Franklin hesitated. That's the troubling part. Evelyn had copies, but they're unusual. They don't appear to be official state documents. They're more like a private arrangement. He handed me a folder containing what looked like a contract between my parents and someone named Clara Davis, dated 28 years ago. The document outlined a private adoption arrangement and mentioned a substantial cash payment. This doesn't look legal, I said, scanning the papers. It's not, Franklin confirmed, which raised serious concerns for your grandmother. She hired a private investigator a few years ago, but couldn't find this Clara Davis. She intended to tell you everything once she had more information. As I stared at the document, a name caught my eye. The witness signature on the contract, Dr. Thomas Mitchell. The same doctor who had supposedly delivered me according to my birth certificate. Something's not right, I said. I need to know more. Franklin nodded. I anticipated you might feel this way. I've taken the liberty of arranging for the same investigator your grandmother used to continue the investigation. Marcus Jenkins is discreet and thorough. With your permission, I can advance some funds from your inheritance to retain his services. Despite my physical pain, my mind was suddenly crystal clear. Do it. I need to know who I really am, and why my parents were willing to let me die. Over the next few weeks, as I slowly recovered and began physical therapy, Marcus Jenkins pieced together fragments of a disturbing story. He found birth records in 3 different counties under my name with slightly different details. He discovered that Dr. Mitchell had lost his medical license 2 years after my birth for ethical violations, though the specific details had been sealed by the court. Most disturbing of all, he found a pattern of suspicious financial transactions between my father and Dr. Mitchell around the time of my birth, large cash withdrawals followed by deposits to Mitchell's personal account. None of this proves anything definitively, Marcus explained during one of his hospital visits. But it suggests your adoption wasn't just private, it may have been illegal. But why, I asked, trying to make sense of it all. Why would they go to such lengths to adopt a baby illegally? Marcus's expression was grim. I'm still working on that piece. But I did find something interesting about your mother's family history. Before she married your father, there was a newspaper article about her engagement that mentioned she was unable to have children due to a medical condition. So they wanted a baby and couldn't have one naturally, I mused. But that doesn't explain why they'd go the illegal route. In the early 90s, private adoption could take years, especially for couples wanting a newborn white baby, Marcus explained. Some people with money and connections found alternatives. As I lay in my hospital bed each night, pieces of my identity crumbling around me, I began to question everything about my life. Were any of my childhood memories genuine? Had there been moments of real love from my parents, or had it all been an elaborate performance? And somewhere out there, did I have a biological mother named Clara Davis who had given me up for reasons I couldn't begin to understand? By the time I was discharged from the hospital 6 weeks after the accident, I was walking with the aid of a walker and had regained significant strength. My parents had visited sporadically, their concern visibly waning as my recovery progressed. I had decided not to confront them with what I'd learned until I had the complete picture, so I maintained a facade of ignorance during their brief visits. Instead of returning to my condo, I arranged to move temporarily into my grandmother's house, which was now legally mine. The familiar surroundings brought both comfort and fresh grief, but it also provided the perfect base for the next phase of my investigation. Marcus Jenkins continued his relentless pursuit of the truth, and 3 weeks after my discharge, he arrived at Grandma Evelyn's house with a thick folder and a grim expression. "I found Clara Davis," he announced without preamble as I let him in. My heart raced. My biological mother. Is she alive? Where is she? Marcus guided me to sit down before answering. "She's alive, but the story isn't what we expected. Clara was just 16 when you were born. She came from a poor family in West Virginia. According to my interviews with her family members, she was approached by a doctor, we believe it was Mitchell, who offered her family $20,000 for her baby. They bought me." The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. "It appears so, but there's more." Clara didn't fully understand what was happening. Her parents made the decision and had her sign papers she couldn't read properly. When she tried to back out a few days before delivery, she was told it was too late. I felt sick. So I wasn't just adopted illegally, I was essentially trafficked. Marcus nodded solemnly. The practice wasn't uncommon in certain circles during that time. Wealthy couples unwilling to wait for legal adoption would pay doctors to find pregnant girls from poor families. The parents would get money, the doctor would get a fee, and the babies would go to families who could afford to pay. And my grandmother discovered this. Not all of it, but enough to be concerned. She hired me about 3 years ago after finding some suspicious documents in your father's study. She was devastated by what we uncovered. Marcus opened his folder and spread out several documents on the coffee table. Birth certificates with conflicting information, financial records showing large cash withdrawals from my father's accounts, and most damning of all, a series of letters between Dr. Mitchell and my father discussing the arrangement in thinly veiled language. "Your grandmother confronted your parents about 2 years ago," Marcus continued. "According to her notes, they admitted to the illegal adoption but insisted they had given you a good life, and that disturbing you with this information would be cruel. I thought about my childhood, materially comfortable but emotionally barren. Had that been their version of a good life?" "There's something else," Marcus said, pulling out another document. "Your grandmother made a recording of that confrontation. She kept it in a safety deposit box with instructions for Franklin to give it to you after her death." He handed me a small USB drive. With shaking hands, I plugged it into my laptop and clicked on the single audio file it contained. My grandmother's voice, weaker than I remembered but still firm, came through the speakers. "I want to know exactly how you obtained Alexandra. No more lies, Richard." My father's voice. "It was a private adoption, Mother Evelyn. We've been through this." "Private or illegal?" My grandmother's tone was accusatory. "I've seen the documents. You bought that child from a teenager who had no idea what was happening." A long silence then, my mother's voice cold and defensive. "We gave her everything. The best schools, the best opportunities. That girl would have grown up in poverty otherwise. We did her a favor." "A favor?" My grandmother sounded outraged. "You stole her from her mother, and now I find out you've been siphoning money from my accounts to cover it up all these years." "That money was to protect all of us," my father insisted. "If this ever got out, we'd lose everything. Your reputation would be destroyed too." "My reputation?" My grandmother laughed bitterly. "I care about that child, my granddaughter, no matter how she came to us. Alexandra deserves to know the truth about who she is." "She'll never know," my mother stated flatly. "And if you tell her, we'll make sure she never sees a penny of your money. We are her legal parents regardless of how that came to be." The recording continued, revealing how my parents had been manipulating my grandmother financially for years, using the threat of exposure to control her. It also revealed that they had actively worked to keep me emotionally distant from them, fearing that too close a relationship might lead to awkward questions about family medical history or resemblances. By the time the recording ended, tears were streaming down my face. Not just for the shocking revelations, but for my grandmother who had carried this burden alone, trying to protect me while seeking justice. "There's one more person I think you should meet, Marcus," said gently when I had composed myself. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson. She was your grandmother's neighbor for 40 years and apparently knew much more than anyone realized. The following day, I visited Eleanor Peterson, an elegant woman in her 80s who welcomed me with tears in her eyes. You look so much like her, she said, studying my face. Like who? I asked, confused. Your grandmother, of course. Evelyn at your age was your spitting image. It's why I never believed that adoption nonsense. I sat down heavily on her floral sofa. What are you saying? Eleanor's eyes widened. Oh dear, you don't know, do you? She took my hand. Alexandra, I believe Evelyn was your biological grandmother. The room seemed to spin around me. That's not possible. My parents adopted me. Did they? Eleanor asked gently. Or did they claim you were adopted to hide something else? Evelyn had a daughter before Margaret. Her name was Caroline. She died in a car accident 29 years ago. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. I struggled to process this information. Are you suggesting? The baby survived. A miracle, they called it. Evelyn was devastated by Caroline's death but overjoyed that her grandchild had survived. Then suddenly, Margaret and Richard announced they were adopting a baby. Evelyn was suspicious of the timing, but was told to keep quiet for the family's sake. Why would they lie? Why not just say they were raising Caroline's baby? Eleanor sighed. Because dear Richard had been engaged to Caroline before he married Margaret. When Caroline died, he quickly married Margaret. The timing would have raised too many questions. The pieces began to fall into place. My grandmother's special attention, my mother's resentment, my father's guilt. I wasn't just any adopted baby. I was the child of my father's first love being raised by his second choice. Evelyn suspected but could never prove it, Eleanor continued. She confided in me over the years. When she found those adoption papers, she knew something was very wrong. The dates didn't align with what she remembered about Caroline's pregnancy. After leaving Eleanor's house, I returned to my grandmother's home and went straight to her study. With new purpose, I began searching through her personal papers, looking for any confirmation of Eleanor's story. In the back of a drawer, I found a locked journal. Using the key that had always hung on my grandmother's necklace, the one she had insisted I take before she died, I opened it to find a detailed account of her suspicions and investigations over the years. The final entry, dated just weeks before her death, read, I believe I have finally confirmed the truth. Alexandra is Caroline's daughter, my true granddaughter by blood. The DNA test results should arrive next week. Then Richard and Margaret will have to face what they've done. My sweet Alexandra deserves to know who she really is. But Grandma Evelyn had died before those results arrived. As I closed the journal, I noticed an envelope that had been tucked into the back cover. Inside was a receipt for a DNA test, and a note with instructions to check her email for the results. With trembling fingers, I logged into my grandmother's email account, which I had kept active to handle her affairs. There in her inbox was an email from the testing company dated 2 days after her death. The results confirmed with 99.8% certainty that we shared a direct familial relationship consistent with grandmother and granddaughter. I was not an illegally adopted stranger. I was my grandmother's flesh and blood, and my parents had not only lied to me my entire life but had been willing to let me die rather than risk the truth coming out. As the full reality of their betrayal washed over me, something hardened inside me. They had tried to erase my true identity, had denied me knowledge of my biological mother, and had been willing to sacrifice my life for their convenience and financial gain. It was time they faced the consequences of their actions, and I knew exactly how to make that happen. The next morning, I called Franklin Barnes and asked him to come to Grandma Evelyn's house immediately. When he arrived, I laid out everything I had discovered and showed him the DNA test results. My God, he murmured, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. Evelyn suspected, but this is beyond what even she imagined. I want justice, I said firmly. Not just for me, but for my real mother, Caroline, and for Grandma Evelyn. My parents have committed fraud, identity theft, and possibly worse. They were willing to let me die to protect their secret and to get their hands on Grandma's money. Franklin nodded gravely. There are serious legal implications here. We should contact the authorities immediately. Not yet, I said, an idea forming in my mind. I want them to confess. I want to hear them admit what they've done. To me directly. And I think I know how to make that happen. Over the next 3 days, Franklin and I, along with Nurse Rachel, who had become a close ally during my hospital stay, developed a carefully orchestrated plan. It hinged on my parents' greed and their belief that I remained ignorant of their betrayal. The key is to make them think they're about to get everything they want, I explained as we sat around Grandma's dining room table. They want Grandma's money and they want their secrets to stay buried. The plan was multi-layered. First, Franklin would contact my parents to inform them that there had been complications with the execution of Grandma Evelyn's will and that their presence was required at her house for an urgent discussion. Meanwhile, Nurse Rachel would help me appear more seriously ill than I actually was, creating the impression that my condition had deteriorated. You'll need to look convincing, Rachel said, outlining the medical aspects we could simulate. Pallor, weakness, difficulty speaking, things that would suggest a turn for the worse. My doctor friend Michael, whom I had known since college, agreed to help by providing medical equipment that would make my decline appear legitimate. I can set up monitors with concerning readings, he offered. Nothing that crosses ethical lines, but enough to be convincing. The centerpiece of the plan was the letter, a document I would draft with Franklin's legal guidance that would lay out every detail of my parents' deception and its consequences. This letter would be placed in Grandma's safe, where my parents would expect to find the will and inheritance documents. The letter needs to be legally sound while also delivering an emotional impact, Franklin advised. It should outline the facts clearly, but also convey the personal betrayal. For 2 days I worked on the letter, pouring every ounce of pain, anger, and determination into its words. When finished, it detailed the truth about my identity, included copies of the DNA test results, and outlined the legal consequences my parents would face: fraud charges, potential imprisonment, and complete financial ruin. The final piece of the plan involved technology. With Michael's help, we set up hidden cameras throughout the main rooms of the house to capture my parents' reactions and hopefully confessions when confronted with the truth. These recordings would serve as evidence if legal proceedings became necessary. As the day approached, I found myself wrestling with complex emotions. Part of me felt guilty about the elaborate deception we were planning. Was I becoming like them, manipulative and calculating? What you're feeling is normal, Franklin assured me when I voiced these concerns. But remember, you're not doing this out of malice or for personal gain. You're seeking truth and justice for multiple victims, including yourself. Rachel added her perspective. I've seen many patients struggle with family betrayal. Sometimes a controlled confrontation is the only way to get closure and move forward. Just be prepared for how it might feel when you finally hear them admit what they've done. The night before our plan was to be executed, I sat alone in Grandma Evelyn's sunroom, surrounded by her plants and memories. I held a photograph of her holding me as a baby, her face radiant with love. Next to it was a photograph I'd found of a young woman who looked remarkably like me, Caroline, my biological mother. I'm doing this for both of you, I whispered to the photographs, and for the truth. The next morning, Michael arrived early to set up the medical equipment in the master bedroom where I would be resting when my parents arrived. Rachel helped apply makeup to make me appear gaunt and ill, coaching me on how to speak with labored breathing and weakness. Franklin called from his car to confirm he had spoken with my parents. They're definitely coming. Richard seemed particularly anxious when I mentioned potential complications with the inheritance. We placed the letter in the safe behind Grandma's favorite painting, a safe my parents knew about and would almost certainly check once they believed I was too ill to stop them. The hidden cameras were activated, their feeds monitored from Michael's laptop in the guest room. Everything was in place. Now all we had to do was wait for the people who had raised me, the people who had been willing to let me die, to walk into the trap we had set. As I lay in bed pretending to be much weaker than I actually was, I felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next, I would finally know the complete truth. And my parents would finally face the consequences of their decades of deception. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Franklin, playing his role perfectly, greeted my parents at the door while I remained in the master bedroom, surrounded by the convincing medical setup Michael had arranged. Through the hidden camera feed displayed on a tablet concealed beside me, I watched as Franklin led them into the living room. My mother was dressed impeccably, as always, not a hair out of place despite her supposedly deep grief over both her mother and my declining health. My father wore his business face, the same expression he used when closing important deals. "How is Alexandra today?" my mother asked, her voice containing just the right amount of concern to sound authentic to someone who didn't know better. "Not well, I'm afraid," Franklin replied gravely. "The doctors believe the brain injury was more severe than initially diagnosed. She's been experiencing increased symptoms and considerable weakness." My father cleared his throat. "That's unfortunate. But you mentioned issues with Evelyn's will. I thought everything was settled." Franklin nodded solemnly. "There are some complications regarding the primary beneficiary designation given Alexandra's condition. I thought it best to discuss this here, where she could be part of the conversation if she feels able. She's resting in the master bedroom now." "Of course," my mother said smoothly. "Perhaps I should check on her first." "She specifically asked not to be disturbed until our meeting," Franklin countered. "The nurse just gave her medication and she needs to rest before we discuss these matters." My father's impatience was visible even through the camera feed. "Let's get to the point, Franklin. What exactly are these complications?" "It's rather technical," Franklin stalled. "But essentially, if Alexandra is deemed medically incompetent, or if her condition becomes terminal, the inheritance flow would change significantly. The trust provisions Evelyn established are quite complex." My parents exchanged a quick glance that spoke volumes. "I've brought the relevant documents," Franklin continued, "but I believe Evelyn kept copies in her safe as well. Perhaps we should retrieve those for comparison." "I'll get them," my father volunteered too quickly. "I know where Evelyn kept her important papers." As he left for the study where the safe was located, my mother engaged Franklin in conversation about the legal implications of various scenarios, all revolving around what would happen to the money if I died, or was permanently incapacitated. Through the tablet, I watched my father enter the study and go directly to the painting concealing the safe. He swung it open with practiced ease, suggesting he had accessed it before without permission. After entering the combination, he opened the safe and immediately began rifling through the contents. His expression changed from anticipation to confusion when, instead of the will documents, he found only a sealed envelope with his and my mother's names written on it in my handwriting. After a moment's hesitation, he opened it and began to read. Even from the camera feed, I could see his face drain of color. His hands began to shake as he flipped through the pages, taking in the DNA test, results, the evidence of financial fraud, and my detailed account of their deception. "Margaret," he called, his voice strained, "you need to come in here, now." My mother excused herself from Franklin and hurried to the study. "What is it? Did you find the papers?" Wordlessly, my father handed her the letter. I watched as her composed facade crumbled while reading it, her perfectly manicured hand coming up to cover her mouth. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "How did she find out? Who told her about Caroline?" "It doesn't matter how she found out," my father snapped. "What matters is what she plans to do with this information. Look at this. She has evidence of everything. The fake adoption, the money we took from Evelyn, even the conversations with Dr. Mitchell." My mother's face hardened. "We need to destroy this immediately. All of it. If she's as ill as Franklin says, we can deny everything. It would be her word against ours." "There are copies," my father pointed out, his voice rising in panic. "And DNA tests. How do we explain that?" "We don't," my mother said coldly. "We deny everything. Alexandra is delirious from her brain injury. No one will believe her." That was my cue. Using the walker I still needed for stability, I made my way slowly but steadily to the study doorway. "They'll believe the recording Grandma made when she confronted you 2 years ago," I said clearly. "And they'll believe the DNA test results she ordered before she died." My parents whirled around, shock evident on their faces. Not just at my words, but at seeing me standing instead of being bedridden as they'd been led to believe. Alexandra, my mother stammered. You shouldn't be up, you need to rest. Drop the act, Margaret, I said, using her first name deliberately. Or should I call you Aunt Margaret, since you're actually my father's second choice after he got my real mother pregnant? My father took a step toward me. You don't understand. We were trying to protect you. Protect me, I laughed bitterly. By denying me medical treatment that could have saved me from paralysis. By coming here to check the safe while thinking I was dying. That's not what was happening, my father insisted, though his eyes darted guiltily to the papers in his hand. Everything is recorded, I informed them, gesturing to the hidden cameras. This entire conversation. Your admission about Caroline. Your plan to destroy evidence and claim I'm delirious. All of it. My mother's face transformed into something ugly and unfamiliar. You ungrateful little. She caught herself visibly struggling to regain composure. After everything we've given you, this is how you repay us, with tricks and recordings. Given me, I stepped further into the room, my voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside me. You stole me. You stole my identity. You kept me from knowing my real mother. You tried to steal Grandma's money. And you were willing to let me die rather than pay for treatment I needed. We raised you, my father shouted. Fed you, clothed you, educated you. Because it was convenient for your image, I cut him off. The perfect family facade. Until it became inconvenient. Until I needed something that would cost you money with no return on investment. I turned to my mother. You resented me from the beginning, didn't you? Because I was living proof that Dad loved Caroline more than you. Her silence was confirmation enough. The police are on their way, Franklin announced from behind me, entering the room with his phone in hand. I've just spoken with Detective Rivera. She's very interested in the evidence we've gathered. My parents' faces registered pure panic. My father looked wildly around the room as if seeking an escape route, while my mother seemed to collapse in on herself, sinking into a chair with her head in her hands. This will destroy us, my father said hoarsely. Our reputation, our business, everything. You should have thought of that before you built your lives on lies, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Before you decided my life was worth less than Grandma's money. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder. My father made one last desperate attempt. Alexandra, please. We can work something out. The money, you can have all of it. Just don't do this. I looked at the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had attended my graduations, who had simultaneously been my father, and the man who betrayed my biological mother. I felt nothing but a hollow sadness. It was never about the money, I told him quietly. It was about the truth. And now everyone will know it. When Detective Rivera arrived with 2 uniformed officers, my parents were still in the study, too shocked to have formulated an escape plan. As they were read their rights and led to separate police cars, neither of them looked back at me. Franklin placed a supportive hand on my shoulder as we watched from the front porch. Are you all right? I wasn't sure how to answer that question. I had just sent the people who raised me to jail. I had exposed family secrets that would forever change my understanding of who I was. I had won, but victory felt complicated and bittersweet. I will be, I finally answered, turning away from the departing police cars to look at the house that represented my true heritage, my grandmother's legacy of love and truth. Eventually I will be. 1 year later, I stood in the backyard of my grandmother's Victorian house, now truly my house in every sense, watching guests mingle around tables decorated with spring flowers. It was the official launch of the Caroline Warren Foundation, an organization I had established using part of my inheritance to help victims of adoption fraud and to advocate for stronger regulations in the adoption process. My physical recovery had been challenging but successful. After months of intensive physical therapy, I no longer needed any walking assistance, though I still experienced occasional pain and stiffness. The doctors called my recovery remarkable. I attributed it to pure determination and the support of the new family I had created around me. Rachel, who had been my advocate in the hospital, was now one of my closest friends and served on the foundation's board. Franklin had become a grandfatherly figure in my life, offering wisdom and guidance as I navigated both legal proceedings and emotional healing. Michael continued to provide medical advice and friendship, his steady presence, a comfort during difficult days. Most surprising of all was my relationship with Clara Davis, not my biological mother, as we had initially believed, but a victim herself in my parents' elaborate deception. After my parents were arrested, Marcus had continued his investigation and finally located Clara in a small town in Oregon. "I never gave up a baby," she had told me. During our first video call, her eyes wide with shock at the story I shared. I was approached about selling my baby, yes. I was young and poor, and my parents were desperate. But I refused. I ran away to my aunt's house and had my daughter there. She's 27 now, a year younger than you. Clara's testimony had been crucial in the case against my parents and Dr. Mitchell, who was located in Florida living under an assumed name. The investigation revealed that my parents had created the fake adoption papers using Clara's name without her knowledge or consent, likely to have some documentation if questions ever arose. The truth about my biological mother, Caroline, had emerged through old medical records and testimonies from hospital staff who remembered the tragic accident that took her life but saved her unborn child, me. My father had indeed been engaged to Caroline before her death and had quickly married Margaret afterward, claiming to have adopted a baby to complete their family and heal their grief. The most healing moment had come 6 months after my parents' arrest, when I visited the small cemetery where Caroline was buried. Standing before her gravestone, I had finally felt a connection to my true origins. I found a photograph of her in one of Grandma's albums I told my guests as we gathered for a toast at the foundation launch. I keep it on my nightstand now. Everyone says we have the same smile. The legal proceedings against my parents had been complex and emotionally draining. In the end, both had accepted plea deals to avoid longer sentences. My father received 8 years for fraud, identity falsification, and financial crimes against my grandmother's estate. My mother received 5 years for her role in the deception and the attempt to deny me medical care. I had visited them only once in prison, not seeking reconciliation but closure. The conversations had been stilted and painful, with neither fully acknowledging the depth of their betrayal. I had walked away knowing I might never see them again and feeling surprisingly at peace with that possibility. Using the bulk of my inheritance, I had established the foundation, renovated my grandmother's house, and set aside funds to complete my physical recovery. The remaining money would be used to search for and help other victims of similar situations, people whose identities had been falsified or whose origins had been concealed from them. Alexandra Franklin's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "It's time for your speech." Taking a deep breath, I made my way to the small podium we had set up on the patio. Looking out at the faces of people who had supported me through the darkest period of my life, I felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you all for being here today," I began. "A year ago, I thought I had lost everything. My health, my identity, my family. What I've discovered since then is that family isn't defined by blood or legal documents. It's defined by love, truth, and support." I glanced at the photograph of my grandmother and biological mother that we had enlarged and displayed on an easel. The Caroline Warren Foundation is named for my mother, who never had the chance to raise me. But it's also created in the spirit of my grandmother Evelyn, who never stopped searching for the truth and who loved me unconditionally. Our mission is simple: to help those whose identities have been falsified, to support ethical adoption practices, and to ensure that no one's origin story is stolen from them as mine was. Because knowing where we come from helps us understand who we are and who we can become. As I continued my speech detailing the Foundation's first initiatives and acknowledging those who had made it possible, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything I had experienced before. The truth had indeed set me free, not just from lies and deception, but from the emotional distance that had characterized my early life. The letter that had changed everything, the one that had revealed the truth to my parents and set justice in motion, now sat framed in my study as a reminder of my journey from victim to advocate. Later that evening, as the last guests departed, and I sat alone in my grandmother's sunroom, now my sanctuary for quiet reflection, I opened her journal to the final entry I had discovered a year earlier. Her words still brought tears to my eyes. My sweet Alexandra deserves to know who she really is. Thanks to her love and determination, I finally did know, and I was using that knowledge to help others find their truth as well. I picked up my phone and opened the camera, deciding to record a video update for the Foundation's supporters. Thank you to everyone who has followed my journey this past year I began. Your comments and messages have meant more than you know. If you've been moved by my story or know someone who might benefit from our Foundation's resources, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed your understanding of yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below. Remember, our true strength comes not from perfect pasts, but from how we rebuild after the truth breaks us open. Thank you for being part of my rebuilding. As I set down the phone, I felt the presence of both my grandmother and the mother I never knew. Their blood ran in my veins, their strength had become mine, and their truth had finally set me free.